The attacks on United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia indicate how this conflict risks spiraling out of control unless serious efforts are urgently made by the Yemeni parties, the region and the international community to end this conflict.
The Yemen conflict intensifies with no end in sight. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. According to the United Nations, violence in Yemen continues to escalate. Recent airstrikes and missile attacks have hit hospitals, infrastructure, airports, and a school. The human toll continues to mount, and UN officials are warning that 8 million Yemenis will likely lose all humanitarian aid next month without an influx of new funding. There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Gerald Feierstein served as the U.S. ambassador to Yemen during the Obama administration. He's currently senior vice president with the Middle East Institute. Trita Parsi is executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Also with us is Baraa Shiban. He's a fellow with the human rights group Reprieve, where he previously served as Yemen project coordinator. And Mohammad Marandi is a professor and chair of the American Studies Department at the University of Tehran. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Mohammad Marandi, let me start with you. This is a war that's been going on for a little over 7 years with devastating consequences for the people of Yemen. In fact, there's a UN report which predicts that if this war continues, the ultimate death toll by 2030 could be 1.3 million. At present, there are about 21 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, including 11 million children. It has been described as a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So how does the war end? Is it just up to Saudi Arabia and Iran? What about the role that the United States has to play?
The narrative about it being a proxy war is basically out there to justify genocide, because Western governments are implicated in the war crimes and the crimes against humanity that we see in Yemen just as much as their ally Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed. So in order to escape the truth of their criminal behavior, they try to depict this as a proxy war. Anyone who looks at the map can see that Yemen is surrounded by the coalition and their Western allies. They're basically strangled from the sea and on land. Yet despite all that, they have managed to maintain control over the north of the country and the capital. And in any other part of the world, the party that has held the capital for so long would be recognized as the representative of that nation. But because of Saudi wealth and because of the alliance between these despotic regimes in the Persian Gulf and the United States and their mutual interests, the people of Yemen, their will is not recognized, their strangulation is maintained, and Western governments continue to fund or to give Saudi Arabia the weapons that it needs, and the thousands of military, tens of thousands of military advisors that they need to continue with the war. The Air Force, without Western and British advisors, cannot maintain the bombing campaign that they are carrying out, where they've been bombing everything in the country. They've destroyed the country. It is the worst humanitarian crisis in the 21st century. And interestingly, because you gave these numbers, first 2 years, the media constantly said 10,000 people have been killed. They wouldn't even, the Western media tried to downplay the genocide in the interests of their own governments.
Yeah. Mohammed, on the point of this being a proxy war, what about the support that the Houthis get from Iran?
Well, I think that the Iranians have a responsibility to support Ansarullah, the Houthis, and the people of Yemen against this coalition, against this genocidal coalition. And what we're seeing in Afghanistan, by the way, is quite similar. Now, as the country is moving towards starvation, We see that the American government is stealing the assets of the people of Afghanistan. Half of the $7 billion is being stolen by Biden to give to families of the 9/11 attacks, whereas those attackers were from Saudi Arabia. Al-Qaeda was created by the United States and its allies. So genocide is not something new to U.S. policy. What they're doing in Yemen is genocide. They're supporting it, genocide. And Iran has a responsibility to help the people of Yemen, but have no doubt it is not because of Iranian support that these people have stood up, protected their capital and their country against this array of forces.
All right, let me go to Ambassador Feierstein. Ambassador, thanks for joining us. What do you make of what you just heard?
It will come as no surprise to you that I don't agree basically with anything we just heard. There was one sentence in there that I think we can all agree to, and that is that it's not a proxy war. It is, in fact, a civil war. As I've written, it is actually a continuation of a conflict that's been going on inside of Yemen for over 60 years now, beginning in the early 1960s when there was a revolt by Republican forces with the support of Egypt against what was then known as the Imamate, which was, in fact, a precursor of the Zaydi Shia movement that the Houthis claim to represent today. And so this is fundamentally a civil conflict. It is among the Yemeni people. It started in the middle of 2014 at a point where most Yemenis, in fact, believed that they were moving towards the culmination of a transition plan that had started in 2011 that produced a national dialogue conference with a number of recommendations and was also a reform of the Constitution, so that the only thing that was left to be done in order to complete this transition was an election. The Houthis, recognizing that they had little or no support in the country and that they could never win or do very well in a fair election, with the support of Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was desperate to find a way to re-seize power after he had been forced to give it up in 2012, launched this attack against the legitimate government of Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi that had been elected overwhelmingly by the Yemeni people. And we have been in this situation of conflict ever since. The fact is that the only reason this war is continuing is because the Houthis have refused to come back to the negotiating table, have refused to agree to a ceasefire, have refused to meet or negotiate with the UN envoy or anybody else. So until they recognize and accept that they can't win a military conflict, this conflict will continue.
Ambassador, on the question of negotiations, there was a report which was written by a very prominent Middle East analyst here in Washington, Bruce Rydell, who worked for the CIA and is currently at the Brookings Institution here in Washington. He wrote in that piece that the Houthis have won, defeating both the Saudis and the United States, which has backed the Saudis. The Houthis, Rydell says, are about to capture the final big city, Reprieve, which is in the north. I mean, what do you make of that assessment?
Well, Bruce is a friend. I like and admire Bruce very much. You might have seen that I wrote a piece that was published in War on the Rocks yesterday that responded to Bruce's piece, as well as some of the others. The unfortunate aspect of Bruce's piece was that it came out just as the world recognized that, in fact, the Houthis had been defeated in Shabwa Governorate and were losing ground in Ma'rib. People have been predicting the imminent fall of Ma'rib for about a year now. It hasn't fallen, and there's no sign that it's going to fall anytime soon. So Bruce's piece was ill-timed and rather unfortunate. His basic assumptions were completely incorrect.
Okay, let's go to Trita Parsi. Trita, great to have you with us. Last February, President Biden expressed his frustration with the war in Yemen. Let's listen to what he said.
This war has to end. And to underscore our commitment, we are ending all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including relevant arms sales.
So, Trita, that was a year ago when President Biden said that the United States is cutting off all offensive support and arms sales. Where do things stand now?
Well, the Biden administration has reversed its position because it is selling weapons. The distinction between offensive and defensive is frankly academic. And we are now in a situation in which the Saudi air attacks against Yemen is standing as high as they did at their highest point during the Trump administration. All of this is happening under Biden's watch. So any actual effort to end the war, which I think Biden originally was quite determined to do, but it required pressure on the Saudis and measures in the region and in its relationship, particularly with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that later on the Biden administration essentially decided that they did not want to take. And as a result, the United States has now enmeshed itself further in a war that is marginal to its own security interests. The only involvement the United States should be having in this is to help bring the war to an end. And unfortunately, the direction that the Biden administration is going is to actually intensify the warfare. I think the thinking behind the Biden administration's strategy here is that if they give more support to the Saudis and the Emiratis, this would then lead to the Houthis being beat back. And once the Houthis are beat back, the Houthis will have a greater interest or change of heart when it comes to a diplomatic engagement on the terms of Saudi Arabia. But that is not what we've seen. All we've seen is that the intensified warfare has led to more suffering and the expansion of the war, because now you have the Houthis also retaliating against the Emirates by attacking Abu Dhabi, which incidentally can bring the United States directly into the war because an attack that was made very close to a U.S. airbase could have led to the death of a U.S. soldier. This is so it's a very unfortunate turn of events in the way that the Biden administration has pursued this.
Trita, just on that point of the United States getting more involved in this war, as you point out, the United States is more enmeshed in it, is intensifying the war. Why is it doing that? What's motivating this expanded U.S. involvement in the war?
I think the answer to that lies in what the Middle East director of the National Security Council, Brett McGurk, has been saying and writing, which is that the United States essentially determined that the Middle East, which they originally thought had lost strategic significance, actually remained strategically significant, not because of the traditional reasons, but because of a desire of making sure that the Chinese are not going to be able to come in and replace the United States and its position in the region. And in the competition with the Chinese, which again, the competition with China, the White House has concluded, is not primarily going to take place in the South China Sea, but rather in Latin America and Africa, in the Middle East and globally. And in the competition with the Chinese, they have determined that America's alliance system is its greatest strength. And as a result, it's going to double down on the alliance system in order to be able to face off whatever future challenge a rising China will bring about. But this means that the United States, as a result, essentially is going to become more deferential to the policies and the desires of regional strategic partners such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So a year ago, when the administration was actually more seriously thinking about reducing its involvement in the Middle East, it was ready to end this war. Now, when it feels like it needs those allies against China, we have seen a complete change of heart and more support for a war that only should be ended.
Baraa Shiban, thanks for being with us. Let's talk about the humanitarian situation in Yemen right now. UN officials are warning that millions of Yemenis will lose all humanitarian aid next month without an influx of money. Nearly two-thirds of major UN programs, aid programs, are being scaled back. In some instances, they're being closed altogether. Where would this leave Yemenis?
Well, I think first of all, we need to understand is we are in a humanitarian situation for a reason. And the reason is because simply in 2014, the Houthis decided by themselves to launch a coup against the transitional process. And with that, they didn't have any alternative plan about who is going to govern or what are they going to do. So what we saw is basically the state institutions started to collapse. And then humanitarian aid started to come in. But with humanitarian aid, it's only limited with humanitarian aid can do. The Yemeni people need the state institutions to start refunctioning. They start to start to work in the country, so we can start to normalize the situation inside Yemen. Yes, the UN agencies now need an influx of cash, if you'd like, to their humanitarian programs, but the Yemeni people cannot rely on humanitarian aid forever. There needs to be, one, a work to de-escalation and a political settlement, and two, a resume of the or reinstating the state institutions, so people can be less dependent on aid and rather dependent on the economy to start reviving. And unfortunately, at this situation, at the current moment, none of these two are happening.
Mohammad Marandi, the Yemeni ambassador to the United Nations, he's been talking about the war. Let's listen to some of what he had to say. He's talking here about who's to blame for what's going on. Let's listen.
The Iranian-supported Houthi militias continue to choose war over peace, undermining the stability and security of Yemen and the region. The militias continue to reject all peace initiatives and waste all opportunities to move forward the political process. The Houthi militias persist, and their escalation in their military aggression against the Yemeni people. All of these actions prolong the conflict and make the road to peace more difficult and more costly, whether economically, politically, or in humanitarian terms.
Right, so according to what we heard there, it's the Houthis that are causing this, and it's up to them to stop.
Well, there are a host of problems here. First of all, it's not the Houthis, it's Ansarullah. And Ansarullah is much more than the Houthis. And second of all, it's Ansarullah and its allies. If Ansarullah did not have popular legitimacy, how could it hold its own against this huge coalition and wealthy coalition that the Saudis are funding, the Emiratis are funding, Canada, the United States, Britain, France, and a host of other Western countries are providing the weapons? How could they hold their own? How could they hold the capital? The only reason why they haven't taken the whole country is because of the brutal Saudi and Emirati bombings and attacks and support for well-funded militias, many of them brought from abroad, mercenaries from Yemen and from the Sudan and elsewhere over the years. The person who made this statement, this so-called ambassador, who gives his salary? He's paid for by the Saudis. The president lives in Riyadh. He can't even live in his own country. Why? Because they don't have popular support. That so-called transition government, the president, he was supposed to be a president for 2 years. He was the only candidate, by the way. And he overstayed the 2 years. He was not the legitimate president. As I said, if it was any other country on this planet, the Houthis, the Ansarullah government, they wouldn't be called Houthis. They wouldn't even be called Ansarullah. They would be called the government of Yemen. But because of Saudi Arabia, because of the United States, because of the Emirates, because of the interests of these countries or these regimes,
right,
they're called the Houthis. But have no doubt that the United States, which is a superpower, it stayed in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it paid the price. And the United States, its economy, its global status has diminished because of these occupations. Right. Do you think that a regime like Saudi Arabia with an unstable leader like Mohammed bin Salman can continue going down this road and get away with it?
Ambassador Feierstein, I want to get back to a point that Trita Parsi raised a moment ago, and that is the expansion of this war that brings in the United Arab Emirates. We know that there's been attacks against the United Arab Emirates. It could lead to an escalation of the war, which would draw the United States into the war as well. The Biden administration, in response to those attacks, sent in F-22 fighter jets. What do you make of that? I mean, how significant is this sort of new front in this war?
Well, it certainly is not helpful, and again, you know, the situation that we're in, and Trita made a few points about where the Biden administration was, where it is today. The reality is that I think that we all supported the initiative that President Biden undertook a year ago to try to re-engage diplomatically, support the UN, urged the Saudis and their coalition to back off of offensive operations outside of Yemen. And in the hope, and we all had the hope, that this would lead the parties to the conflict back to the negotiating table and open a path to a peaceful resolution. It hasn't worked that way. Instead, what's happened is that the Houthis have doubled down on their aggression inside Yemen and Ma'rib and elsewhere, as well as across the border. When they encountered a significant defeat in Shabwa Governorate and were forced to withdraw from there, what they did is that they tried to expand the conflict using Iranian-supplied weapons, drones and missiles, to attack UAE and try to blackmail them, frankly, into ending their support for the anti-Houthi opposition. This is a dangerous play that they're making. It is despite the fact that the UAE has engaged with Iran for about 2.5 years now in an effort both to reduce tensions in the region as well as to encourage an end to this conflict. And so this is a dangerous moment. You're absolutely right that if the missiles had struck a Dhafra air base and killed American servicemen, it would have been a very different situation. I would also say that if one of those missiles that was aimed at the airport in Abu Dhabi had hit a passenger terminal instead of falling in a remote area of the airfield and killed a number of people, that also would have been a very different situation. And I think that we need to recognize that at that point, it wouldn't be the Houthis who are being held to account. It would be the government of Iran that supplied these weapons in the first place.
Trita Parsi, what do you make of what the ambassador just said, that it's a dangerous play by the Houthis to say that, look, if these coalition forces continue to attack us in this way, then we will continue to fire these missiles at places like the United Arab Emirates?
Obviously, escalating the war by any side is not a good thing. But we also have to understand that escalation tends to beget escalation, and that is exactly what has happened now. The limited effort by the Biden administration to get diplomacy going, which didn't last for many months, should not have been ended and then shifted towards the United States actually actively taking any side in this conflict, which it now has done again. That is not in the interest of the United States. Diplomacy needs time. Diplomacy needs a lot of political will, rather than giving it just a few months and then say, well, it didn't work, so let's bomb the crap out of this country. We have to also keep one thing in mind, that when it comes to, for instance, the attack against the airfield near Abu Dhabi airport, absolutely, Ambassador, right, we should be very happy that it didn't strike any of the terminals. But the Saudis have been bombing the airport in Sana'a quite actively for the last 2 months. So, we're talking about this as if the Houthis are doing things that the Saudis are not. Unfortunately, both sides are engaged in terrible, terrible activities, but the Saudi coalition is attacking Yemen with a factor of about 12 or 13 times the amount of attacks that the Houthis are doing, for instance, on Saudi soil. So there's a massive imbalance in what is happening right now between two sides that are both engaging in very negative activities. But that imbalance, I don't think, is really reflected in this conversation, and it's certainly not reflected in the manner in which the Biden administration has chosen to approach this issue.
Baraa Shiban, we've been talking about the humanitarian situation, the food crisis in Yemen right now. But there was a report which was published by New America here in Washington. It's a Washington think tank, which says that in this war, I mean, in addition to the humanitarian crisis, there's also another war being fought here, and that is an economic war. A senior researcher at New America says rapidly rising food prices, or prices rather, has put food and basic goods out of the reach of many, many Yemenis. Each side at this stage produces its own currency. There is corruption and a lack of jobs. How does this factor into the crisis that the country faces right now?
Yeah, I mean, allow me quickly to comment on what your guest mentioned.
Sure.
The narrative that has been going on for some time, I think it could have found some ground to stand on at the first 2 years of the conflict. But we need to understand that the the main narrative that has been going on, especially in the United States, have basically removed any agency from the Houthis and what they have been doing. Since just the beginning of this year, they have fired over 10 ballistic missiles on the city of Marib, causing the death of over 36 civilians. Over the last year, while there was a clear de-escalation by the coalition front, the Houthis continue to strike both inside Yemen and also outside Yemen, into Saudi Arabia, and then very recently into the UAE. So this is not just something that the UAE suddenly just did with the current attack on the very recent attack on Abu Dhabi. It's consistent with their policy that they think that the signs that the Biden administration have been sending since it came to power, the appeasement policy that has been followed, hasn't been actually working with the Houthis. Of course, we have to be critical of any strikes that Saudi Arabia has been conducting, and we continue to report and criticize all of their strikes on populated areas. Yeah. We also need to put that it takes actually two sides of this equation to reach a political settlement. And the Houthis haven't been helping since the beginning of this conflict, and I'm not sure that they are going to be helpful anytime soon. And adding to what you just mentioned about the humanitarian and the economical situation, you can imagine in all of the areas that the Houthis control, despite actually doubling down on getting revenues and taxes, they haven't paid public salaries for over 3 years now. And the humanitarian agencies have been complaining about constant theft of the humanitarian aid program. So there needs to be a serious confrontation about what the Houthis are doing and how this constant blocking of the political and humanitarian efforts is actually causing the suffering of the Yemeni people.
All right, Mohammad Marandi, I've only got a minute left, but I want to look at this. There's been one other development here in Washington. President Biden took the Houthis off the foreign terrorist list. Now he's under pressure from Congress to put them back on that list. If he does so, what impact will that have?
Well, I find it stunning that your guest calls this appeasement. There's a genocide going on. The Saudis and their allies are preventing food from getting into the country. They've been doing it for years. They've been using food as a weapon. And then the Houthis are the problem? The Houthis fire a few missiles in response. As Trita pointed out, the violence is utterly disproportionate. Comparison. And the war is not a civil war. Without the Saudis and the Emirates and Western countries backing these militias, many of them foreign fighters, they wouldn't stand a chance. So I think we have to be answerable to our children and our grandchildren about the genocide that's taking place in Yemen. And if we're not honest about what's going on, we are complicit.
Okay, and I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.